Hey developers, what is going on? It's the Savage Coder, and this is episode 16. In this episode, we're going to dive in and we're going to plan out our whole application. We've got some basic views now, but I want to plan out the whole picture of what our app's going to be like and what it's going to do, and we'll build some database tables to store our data and look at our feature list. So if you don't have SQL Server installed, check out the video short on SQL Server, and you can find that in the card above. So we've got a lot to do. Let's jump in and get to it. To start with, I jotted down my ideas just in Notepad++. So let's take a look at what I have here, and I should be able to make that font a little bigger. This is not a traditional architectural setup. This is very loose and kind of from the hip, but I just wanted to share a thought process with you so that you know how I got to this place. So I broke this up into some different features and use cases in the application. So we're going to need a sign up, and to sign up, I've decided on we're going to collect first name, last name, your email, the user's password, their postal code, let them choose a username, and they'll be able to upload a picture. Also with sign up, we're going to do an email confirmation. So we'll send them an email. We'll need to give the user the ability to resend an email in case it wasn't delivered, or maybe they delete it by accident, or it ended up in their spam folder and it got deleted, whatever the situation. In addition to sign up, we'll need to be able to log in. We will be logging in with the email and the password that we collected when the user signed up. We'll have two different states once someone logs in. One is that they are confirmed and another that is not confirmed. So we're going to have to track that. And a not confirmed login is just someone that signed up, but they haven't clicked the link in their email yet. So we'll still let them log in. We'll check their email and password credentials, but if they haven't confirmed yet, we'll just take them to a place where we can say, hey, you haven't confirmed your email yet, click here to resend, and that's kind of where this resend would come in. There also can be on the login screen a forgot password, which is similar to sending an email for confirmation, but this one would send a random ID to the user's email so that they can click a link and come back to the site, and they would need to reset the password. So resetting the password will be independent of the confirmation. All right, we'll also have a user home. This is once you log in where you'll be taken to by default. It will have a profile tab, which will show your picture, your postal code, the date you joined, and it'll show a list of any items that you bought and a list of items that you have sold. It'll have a section on there for items that you currently have for sale, and you'll be able to click on any of those items and see the details. We kind of already made these screens, at least the basic versions of them. And then we have to have a view that will allow you to add new items that you want to sell. And we'll have to add support for tags so that we can tag what something is, so you can search either by the words in the description or the title or any tags that you add to your items for sale. So if you're selling a guitar, you could add a tag for music, and anybody that searches music would also see your guitar, even if you didn't put the word music in the title. And we need the ability to edit items that are for sale and to remove items that are for sale. They could either be sold, or you may just cancel the sale. We'll also have on the home page a list of items that you purchased. So let's change our terminology up here to purchased as well, which makes these duplicates. So let's remove this one. Okay. We also need a search box and a search results view. that will show all the items that are being sold on the site. And then I have some stretch goals, which are things that aren't really required, but if we have time, it would be nice to put those in, like searching by georadius so that I can limit my search to items that are near me or that are within a certain amount of miles for sale so that I can go pick them up rather than have them be shipped. And an I18N support if we want to support multiple languages. That would be nice to add as well. So I think this is a big list. It'll give us plenty to work through, and we'll use some of this to set up our initial database. The rest of this will be used to drive the views and the APIs that we build to support these features. So let's jump in and create a database for the basics of this. We'll probably have to make changes as we go, but we can get a pretty good start. So I'm just going to move this off to my other monitor, and I'm going to launch SQL Server, which I have a link for it right here on my Start menu. If you do need to start your database, I'll show it this one time where you can go to Services. Mine is set to automatic. I always go to the standard tab because it's easier to read. Double click when you're between these two columns and you get that cursor so that we can read the whole thing. And if we go to SQL Server and the name of your server, the instance name, you can see that mine is running. It's set to automatic. So if you want to start it or stop it, you can just right click and stop, and then you can also wait for it and then you can start. Sometimes you have to refresh this page to refresh the statuses here, but usually it works. So mine's already running, so I am good. If you have yours set, if you want to change this from automatic to manual or manual to automatic, you can right click this entry and go to properties, and you can change that in this drop down right here. All right. So here is my SSMS. I'm going to connect to my local database engine. So I'm going to choose connect here and database engine. If you don't see this Object Explorer, you can go under View and choose Object Explorer or hit F8, and that will bring this window up. So under Connect Database Engine, I'm going to leave this on localhost because it is running locally, and I'm going to leave mine on Windows Authentication. If you followed my SQL Server install, when we added the local user, that's this user, so we're going to connect with those credentials. So mine should look just like yours now if you expand databases. So I'm going to right click on databases and choose new database. In the database name box, I'm going to type Savage Cell. All of the defaults here are fine, so you can just hit OK. All right, now we have our empty database. A database is a collection of tables, and tables are collections of rows of data. You can think of each table as if it's an Excel spreadsheet. So you have rows of data, and each row is made up of different columns, and the columns, like data types in programming, can each hold a specific type of data. We're going to create places where we can store and query our data. So I'm going to expand Savage Cell, and if you look under tables, there are only system tables in here. This all just comes by default with a new database. Let's create our tables. So I'm going to right click the tables folder and do new table. Here's where we name the columns and the data types of each bucket within our table. So this is going to be the users table. So if we look at what we need for our users, these are the items that we're going to get initially to sign up. So before I do that, every user needs a unique identifier. So I'm going to type user ID, and I'm going to choose the data type of an int. Now, because this is what we call a primary key, this is what is going to be unique about every user. We technically could have two users with the same first name and last name, and we need some guaranteed way of identifying a user. So I'm going to do that by saying no user can be null. So I'm going to uncheck this allow null. So because two rows with a null user ID would make user ID not unique. I'm going to make sure that my user ID row is selected, and I'm going to click this little set primary key icon. I believe you can also right click and set primary key here. And that'll put a little key icon. That tells SQL Server this is my unique identifier here. Now I don't want to have to come up with an int that I know is not used yet for every user. So if I bring this little column window up and we look down in here, if I expand identity specification and I change is identity to yes, I can do that by double clicking or by pulling the drop down. If I tell it the identity specification identity is yes, what I'm telling it in these three rows here is I want SQL Server to assign an int. I want it to increment by 1 for each row, and I want to start it at number 1. So I've got my user ID. My next column name is first name, and I'm going to make that a varchar, which is a variable character array. I feel like nobody's first name is bigger than 50 characters. And by making it a varchar instead of just a char, the varchar will only take up the amount of characters that you give it for first name in the database. If I change that to char 50, every column for first name would take up 50 characters of space, regardless of the actual length of the data in the column. So you almost always want to use varchar if you're designing your own things, unless you have a specific need for a 3-character entry and you know it's always going to be that. Everybody needs a first name, so there's no nulls there. Same with last name. I'll also make that 50. No null. An email. I'm going to make that varchar 255 just to, misspelled it. Varchar 255. You definitely need an email. You can't log in without one. We'll talk about this password field later. We're going to start off by using an encrypted password, and then we're going to talk about how to use OAuth 2 and OIDC to let another system handle all this where we don't even know the password. And even in the system where we're going to develop the mechanism for dealing with the passwords, we still will never know what a password is. Encrypted passwords can get long, so I'm going to use a varchar max, which will just adapt to the size of the password. And we definitely don't want to allow nulls for passwords. Postal code. We'll make it 25. I don't think any postal code in the world is more than 10 or 12 characters, but just to play it safe. And we have a username. That I don't want crazy long usernames, so let's limit those to 15 characters. Everybody needs a username and a picture. We're not actually going to store pictures in the database, although you could as a data type of blob, where you actually serialize the data and send the bits into the database. But we will be storing the images on our hard drive, and so we're going to need the path to those. So system paths will make this 255. I don't think we're going to have anything longer than that. It's going to be a local reference within, 1 or 2 folders. So not everyone will have a picture, so we'll let that one be nullable. And so that covers all of the items that we had for signing up. So we need some other things, like we need to know if the user is blocked or active. So we'll have an active flag. I'm going to make that a bit. A bit is like a Boolean. It's a 1 or a 0. And I'm going to tell it that I don't want nulls because that would be a third state, right? A 0 or a 1 or a null is 3 possibilities. I want this user to be active or not active. But what I am going to do is I'm going to go down to this default value, and I'm going to say by default, I want everybody to be a 1. I want everybody who signs up new to be active. We also want to know if a user has confirmed their email. So we can put an is confirmed, which is also a bit. That also will not take a null, and that one we're going to default to 0 because everybody starts off unconfirmed as a new user. What else? We have our profile picture, our location, the join date. So for join date, we're going to create a created date column, and that will be a date time. And we don't want any nulls in there. My default value is going to be a method call to get date. And in SQL, that will get the current date and stick it in. So even if we don't pass it in, the created date will update to the current date. And then we may as well also put in a modified date. That way, if we change anything, we can update the modified date, and we also want that to just get the current date. Let's check our notes. So we've got our join date. Items purchased is going to be in other tables. Items for sale is other tables. Search has to deal with items. And I think we're okay here. So that looks like a pretty good start for a users table. So I'm going to click save. And it's going to ask me for a name for the table. And I'm going to call this table users. So I'll click OK. And it will create our table. So if you want to see the table, you're going to have to right-click tables and do a refresh. And now you can see our user table here. You can see the columns that we created. Next, I'm going to right-click tables again. We're going to do a new table. This is going to be our items table. So we already have some of that. So if we look at our code, we can see that our product has these properties. So that's kind of the base of what we need. So we'll start with that stuff. Let's do that. Each item for sale is going to have an item ID. And again, it's going to be int. We're not going to allow nulls. And we're going to make it a primary key. So set primary key. And then under identity spec, we'll change that to yes. And now we're good with our primary key. Each item will have a title. And we don't want this to get too long because we want to be able to show it in search results. So I would limit that maybe to 25 characters. And each item needs a description. Now we may do a short description, long description, but for now we're just going to leave it as description. And I don't care how big this is. We'll just make that a varchar max and let people blab as much as they want. That also cannot be null. After our description, we have an image, and that again is just going to be a path to a picture. Now we may have more than one picture. We're going to start with one to keep it easy, but maybe we'll eventually split this image out into its own table and have many images per item. And while we have location here, I'm thinking that's just postal code in the database. And what did I make it for users? I made the postal code 25, so we'll keep it the same here. And the asking price. I'm going to call it asking price because I think we'll start with a shopping cart style buy it button, but we'll probably enhance that where you can ask for a certain price, but then instead of a buy button, it'll be a make a bid, make an offer me some amount. And we'll let the seller decide whether they want to accept the amount or not. And the asking price is going to be a data type of money. Money stores the actual amount of data without any formatting. So everybody needs an asking price, even if it's $0.00. And so that is good for our item. Let me see if there's anything else here. So the only thing that we need to support is tags. And I don't know if we'll implement that on day one, but we can add support for it in the database now. But before we do that, let's go ahead and put a created date. With a default get date and a modified date of get date. Oops. And we also want an is active. And is active will default to 1 for now. We can have an is sold. So if it's not active, you could have just canceled it, or it could be not active because it's been sold. So is sold is going to start with 0 because it's not sold yet. And I'm going to move these modified dates down. I like those at the bottom if I can. I don't move those around once I save because it has to actually drop the table and recreate it. So I don't usually do that. Looks like that's good for items. So I'm going to hit save. We'll name the table items. You can refresh. We're going to need a table to store a relationship, which is items that belong to a user. So if I want to be able to, right now I can put me in the users table and you in the users table. And I can load up the items table with items that are for sale, but how do I know that I'm the seller? And how do I know that you're the buyer if you buy it? So we need a middle table between these two to represent my items, or my sold items, the items I bought, or the items I'm selling. So we can store all the items, whether they're bought or sold, in the items table. That doesn't matter. So one way of looking at the items is that you could put a user ID into this item table, which is the originator of the item, maybe the person selling the item. You could have a seller ID that's actually the user ID, and you could have a buyer ID that is another user. They're both users in the system, but one's a buyer and one's a seller. The problem that comes in if you add them to this items table is, what if I have this, what if I'm selling a digital download of something? I have an ebook that I'm selling. I have an unlimited number of ebooks that I can sell. I don't want to have to put a new item in the item table for every single ebook. So I need to be able to say, this buyer bought the ebook, this buyer bought the ebook, this buyer bought the ebook. And so items would only have one row for an ebook, but it could have multiple people that buy it. Now, what I'm thinking about now is that there's really only one seller. You can't have two people selling one item. So I think the seller ID actually belongs in the items table. And I'm going to delete these. That was just for example. And then we need a middle table for all the buyers of the item, because more than one person can buy an item. Let's go ahead and add a user ID that's an int. And because there's no data in this table, I can actually move this. So I'm just going to drag it up to be the second. So I've got my primary key, which is an item ID, and then I've got this foreign key that's a user ID. The reason it's a foreign key is because user ID is a primary key in the users table, right? This is our unique identifier for each user. So if I put the same ID in this table, in the items table, it's actually a foreign key from the users table, right? So users.userid is the items.userid. So what I want to do is I want to make a relationship between this user ID table and the user ID in this table. And the reason is if we have that constraint, it won't let me add a user ID into items that does not exist in the users table. So it kind of protects your data integrity. And if I click on this row, you can see this relationships button. So I probably can also do it from here. Yeah, right click and do relationships. So what I want to say about this is I want to create a new relationship. And you can see FK stands for foreign key. And right now it's items_items. What we're going to do is we're going to go to this second tables and column specs under general. And if we go over to the right, there's a little ellipsis here that we can click. So if we click that, so what I want to do is I want to do a foreign key relationship between users and items. And now the primary key table is users. So I'm going to select users. And then in the list here, I'm going to select the user ID. And then I want that to be a foreign key to the items user ID. So now that I've tied those together, if I hit save and hit yes, if yours complains that it can't do the process because it would drop the table, because we're just designing this stuff fresh now, just go under Tools, Options, and you'll want to turn this off anyway. It's under, I think, Designers. Yeah. Designers, Table and Database Designers, and uncheck Prevent Saving Changes that require table recreation. So if you uncheck that, it'll allow you to save this. All right, so now we've got a user ID that ties to our users table. That's good. But now we need that middle table so that one user can buy many items. So I'm going to, right-click Tables, New Table. And I like to name these after the table that they're joining. So I'm going to call this User Item ID. I'm going to give this an ID of its own. It's going to be a primary key. And it's going to have an identity spec just like the others. So I'll expand that. Double click is identity. And then it's also going to have a user ID. And it's going to have an item ID. So the other thing we could put in here is the date that it was purchased. Which is a date time, because the only records going in here are when a user buys an item. So the date it was purchased, and we'll put a default if we don't pass it in of get date, and we'll want a purchase price, which is money. And we may as well put a created date. Well, created date. Created date is really the date that it was purchased. So let's just do that so it matches the other date time. Oops. Get date. And let's remove date purchased. We can just use our created date as the date it was purchased. So let's save that. Well, let's not save that. So now we just have to hook up our 2 foreign keys to their tables. So we will go to our relationships. We will create a first foreign key. We'll click on the ellipsis. And this is going to be the foreign key between users. And this is going to be user items. So users.userID is going to map to this table's user ID. And then we'll have another foreign key that is going to be the items to user items. And so the items item ID will map to this table's item ID. And close and save. And this will be called user items. So when we sell an item, the user ID is who bought the item. The item ID is the item that they bought, which is described by that ID row in this table, how much they bought it for, and what the date was when they bought it. We don't have support for tags. Let's add that, and I think that's going to be it for now. So right-click table, new table, and each tag will have a tag ID. It's going to be a primary key, and it's going to have is identity yes. And it'll just have a tag name. Tag shouldn't be very long. So one other thing you could add is the created by, and you could put who created it and who modified it, but we're not going to get that crazy with it. Okay, so now we've got a tag name. So this is just a list of tags. And we'll just call that tags. And one more table, which is the item can have as many of those tags as you want to choose. So this is really like an item tags middle table. So item tag ID, primary key, is identity. And this will have an item ID and a tag ID. And we'll just add and remove those. I don't think we need anything else in here. So let's just add the relationships for those, for those 2 items. So we'll have items, item tags. So items, item ID will map to this table's item ID, and this one will map tags to item tags. Tags, tag ID to this table's tag ID. And let's save that, and we'll call this item tags. And so if we got it right, we should be able to expand these database diagrams. Yes, I want to add support for diagrams. And I should be able to right click and say new database diagram. Index was outside the bounds of the array. Isn't that wonderful? Well, I'll have to take a look at my installation and see why I can't show you the database diagram, but it would show the tables and how they're linked to each other through these keys and foreign keys. I think this is a good stopping point. We have a pretty good database set up here that's going to drive our basic design. We still have to script this out so that you can pull this code down from Git and run the scripts, and it'll create this whole database. I'll write some scripts that will populate this with some dummy data, and we'll write some stored procs in the next episode so that we can query that data and we can bring it into our API and show it in our web application. So I think we've got one more episode in SQL Server at least, and hopefully we can get through that. And hopefully I didn't lose you on some of the relations in this video. If you go back and re-listen to the way I describe these relationships and what's going to be in these tables, I think if you do have questions, they'll be specific questions. So please hit me up in the comments below, and I can, drill down a little further with the actual problems or misunderstandings that you might have. So until next episode, practice this stuff, make your own database, and play around with it, and we will continue this and continue our application build. I will put this notepad idea list into the API project in GitHub. We'll just put it under a documents folder in there, and I will script all of this database stuff out, and we'll add that in there as well so that you don't have to type all this stuff out, and yours will be exactly like mine. So perfect. I think we are good to go. And if you found this useful or helpful, please click the subscribe button and the bell. That helps me out tremendously, and I do appreciate it greatly. I will get the next episode ready, and I will see you online.